everybody. We greatly appreciate you donning masks and being here in person, those I'm talking to in person. We do have probably many more, I know many more, please sign up, online. So this is a bit of a hybrid. We are recording this session. My name is Anand Mati. I'm a finance and economics professor here and a director, together with co-founder of the Corporation Society Initiative, CASI. CASI is now in its 4th year, and we focus on issues in the intersection of markets, business, government, and society to promote good governance and accountability. We engage with communities at GSB and much beyond to broaden and deepen the discussion, to involve in research, in teaching, and in policy work to try to ensure that institutions work for society and their governance structure. We're a collaborative effort of faculty, staff, and students. We have enthusiastic leaders, one of whom is going to lead today's discussion, Chris Cobham, and another one is Anna Zimmerman here, monitoring the online participants. So we are so excited today to have a speaker who is the author of a book, a must-read book called "This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends." Nicole Perlroth will be introduced again by Chris Cobham, but I will say that she symbolizes what journalism does for us, which is goes there where people don't want stuff reported and actually get the information out and bring it out and then write it out in a book that's like a thriller about what is really going on and what we must pay attention to, which is cyber weapons in the market and the mix of governments and private sector companies involved. Nicole just spent part of the morning with the class. We're just coming out of a class where we had an awesome discussion of the issues. And I'm going to quit by just saying that this is an exciting week for CASI because we have 3 events. This is the middle one. We had an event yesterday and we have another one on Friday with Representative Rokana, where we'll continue discussing issues around internet regulation and other things. So Chris will take it from here. Thank you very much again for coming.
Thank you, Anat. And good to see everybody here today, here in the room and on Zoom. As Anat mentioned, I am a 2nd-year MBA student here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and one of the student co-leaders of the Corporations and Society Initiative. It is my pride and honor to introduce award-winning journalist and Stanford alumna, Nicole Perlroth. Nicole has reported on cybersecurity for the New York Times since 2011, after getting her start reporting on venture capital startups for Forbes earlier. She's here with us today to discuss some of her findings, distilled and retold through the narrative of her new book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, which released earlier this year. I spent the last couple of weeks with Nicole's book, and as someone with next to no technical background on this subject, I'll say personally that this is perhaps the most engaging introduction to the world of cybersecurity that I could ask for. So without further ado, let's give Nicole a warm welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you all hear me okay? No, not really. Better? Okay, all right. Thanks for having me. It's always good to be back at Stanford, and I loved being in Anat's class and Rob's class just now. It was so wonderful to see people in person. So I know that this is annoying, but thank you so much to those of you in the room, and thanks to everyone else joining in. And thank you, Chris, for agreeing to interrogate me today.
So, Nicole, I think the audience would love if you could just maybe start by telling us a little bit about some of your work reporting for the Times on this subject and sort of the experience of putting the book together and maybe some of the highlights of that journey.
So I'll just say, this really, the book is my own personal journey into this world of cybersecurity. I was really thrown into the deep end. I tell the story in the book. I was happily working on venture capital at Forbes.
And I got this call from the New York Times and they said, we're looking at you for this job, but we're not sure you're going to want to take it. And I said, well, you're the New York Times. I'll take whatever it is. How bad could it be? And they said, it's cybersecurity. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. Not only do I not know anything about cybersecurity, I've actively gone out of my way to learn as little as possible about cybersecurity. But I will come and I will interview and I will tell my grandkids one day that the New York Times invited me into the building, and we'll just leave it at that. But I knew I was going to have to be very candid with these editors at the New York Times that there were more qualified people to cover this beat. And I did that, and I actually showed up with a list of possible candidates. I said, here are some people who seem to cover cybersecurity quite well. You might want to actually interview them. And they said, the thing is, we've already interviewed those people on your list and we couldn't understand anything that they were talking about. So began my illustrious entry to the New York Times. And so what I realized very early on is that what they really wanted was a translator, someone who could talk about these issues in a way that our readers who might have very little technical understanding of the issues involved, who've never coded, who might know how to use email on their iPhone, but not much more than that, could really understand. And I set out to do that. And one of the first things that happened was that the New York Times was hacked by a Chinese state-sponsored group. And I learned about it and I asked our security team if I could essentially embed with them. So I embedded with our security team and then a little known startup called Mandiant, which is now FireEye, which has become the Ghostbusters of cybersecurity. When you have a breach, that's usually your first call. And we watched as the guy we started calling the Beijing summer intern would roll into our networks at 8 a.m. Beijing time, and they'd roll out around 5 p.m. Beijing time in search of what we ultimately concluded was our sources. And I remember the FBI came to the New York Times, and you had this sort of instinct as an American that, okay, the FBI is going to catch these guys, we're going to turn over our logs, we're going to find out who they are, and we're going to get these guys. And instead, they just said, thank you very much for all of this important information, close their binders, and we never heard from them again. And that was really my equivalent of a GSB education in the world of cybersecurity, was seeing that American businesses were being targeted by advanced nation state threats, and there really was no cavalry. And this was happening everywhere. There was this catchphrase that's been plagiarized over and over again, but it was originally said by Dmitry Alperovich, who was one of the co-founders of CrowdStrike. And he said, there's only 2 types of companies left in the United States, companies that have been compromised and companies that don't know they've been compromised yet. And I set out to find out if that was true. And lo and behold, it really appeared that that seemed to be the case. That everywhere you looked, companies were experiencing hundreds, thousands, in some cases, millions of cybersecurity incidents every week. Some of them were leading to breaches of their intellectual property, which was being carted off by Chinese state-backed hackers. Some of it was increasingly coming from governments like Iran, which was hitting US banks and Wall Street with these denial of service attacks to try and take them offline. We saw the North Korea attack on Sony Pictures, and we saw a rash of cybercrime against retailers like Home Depot and Target, Neiman Marcus, over and over again. And then more recently, we've seen ransomware, and really at a frequency that I think no one ever could anticipate or even imagine. And so I've been running from these fire to fire to fire for the last 10 years. And I wanted to pull my head up and just for my own purposes, process everything that I had been writing about and covering. And I realized I needed to write a book because I've been covering all of these attacks, many of which landed on the front page of the New York Times. But I don't think it was landing with the American consciousness. I don't think people were realizing just how pervasive this threat was, just how likely it was that they would be hit by one of these cyber attacks. And I think it really was screaming out for a narrative. And then there was this other thing, which was the attacks were getting worse and the stakes were getting higher because these attacks were hitting our critical infrastructure. And when I asked myself, where is the cavalry? Because I just told you what happened with the FBI. There was none, but also there was this other thing I learned, which was, and you'd heard rumors about this forever, and there'd been some thin reporting on it and a few really good stories, but most people had no idea this was happening, which was actually the compromise that our own government, the US government, the trade-offs that the US government was making at the expense of cybersecurity in the name of national security. What do I mean by that? When an intelligence agency like the NSA would find a hole in a widely used piece of software like Microsoft Windows, they weren't automatically tipping off Microsoft about it and getting it fixed and getting their software patched and updated. Their gut instinct was to say, what can we use this for? Can we use this for counterterrorism, counterintelligence, maybe battlefield preparations, as more of our adversaries put Siemens industrial software or Schneider electric software into their power plants and their nuclear plants? These are important entry points for us to implant ourselves in the event we need to take out the centrifuges at an Iranian uranium enrichment plant or Russia's power grid or pipeline maybe. They weren't just stockpiling these things, there was actually a market for this. So when a hacker would find what's called a 0-day, I'll just briefly stop there, but when they would find a hole that no one knew about in technology like Apple iOS software, Microsoft Windows, they could sell that into a really lively market of brokers and intermediaries and defense contractors who would sell that to the US government that could add it to their stockpile. What struck me was the moral dilemma involved, besides basically leaving American companies more vulnerable and to leave them to be conduits for nation state attacks. This wasn't, some obscure flavor of Huawei software that we were finding these holes in and stockpiling. This was technology that Americans relied on too. So when we found a hole in these systems and we left it open, we weren't just leaving it open for Russians or Iranians or whoever, we were leaving it open for Americans. And meanwhile, we've been in this decade of software eats the world. We've been baking this software into our most critical infrastructure just because we could. And so when the US government would hold on to a vulnerability in that software, they were also making it more likely that someone else would find that hole and use it back on American infrastructure. And so that's why I wrote the book, was I need people to know about this. We need to be having conversations, nuanced conversations about the trade-offs involved. And I need my mom to know what's been going on because she has no technical understanding. She has no idea what I've been up to. And she keeps bothering me with these phone calls every day. And I need to let her know that this is happening. I can't be bothered until after 5:30 p.m. PT. So I wrote this book really for her. And, I tell these stories over and over again about what it's like to be thrown into the deep end and to be asking these questions about these trade-offs that for whatever reason, I don't think people in the field were asking enough. And I actually think it almost needed a younger, non-technical woman maybe to come in and say, wait a minute, what are you doing? What is this? I don't get it. And that I don't get it is really what led to this book.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. So I think, as you've alluded to, this book really took this really complicated subject, made it digestible for your average person who doesn't come from a coding background, a cyber background, a technology background. But as you could probably glean from the pages of the book, if you've read it, it's a very secretive world. They clearly were slow to trust, and I would venture that maybe that trust was never fully won. How did you manage to really kind of penetrate and infiltrate that world? Cover what was going on, and sort of get people to be a little bit forthcoming.
So I'd liken this. So it's called the 0-day market. The 0 days are the vulnerabilities and the code to exploit those vulnerabilities, and that code is what is sold to these government agencies, often through intermediaries. So the 0-day market is like Fight Club. That's what I write in the book. It's like Fight Club. The first rule of the 0-day market is nobody talks about the 0-day market. The second rule of the 0-day market is nobody talks about the 0-day market. Because when you talk about this trade, then you reveal the security dilemma that is inherent to this market, the moral dilemma inherent to this market. But more importantly, this code is being sold for millions of dollars. There's a company outside the Beltway called Zerodium. You can just go to their website and they'll list off their price list for 0-day exploits in your iOS iPhone. That the going rate right now, I think, is $2.5 million. So you could sell it for that. You could also sell it to a Saudi broker that'll pay you $3 million. The caveat is you can never talk about it, because the minute you talk about it, Apple learns about that 0-day, they patch that 0-day, they update their software, you get the annoying prompt to update your software, and suddenly that $3 million investment that government just made, the money that hacker just got, turns to dust. And the market's actually pretty sophisticated now, that they actually have exclusivity clauses sometimes. They have clauses that say, we'll pay out over a set number of quarters or months. And so long as this 0-day doesn't get patched by Apple, we'll continue to make these payments. So everyone is incentivized to shut up. And so it became a really hard nut to crack as a journalist. And I spent a lot of time talking about that in the book. People like Leon Panetta was like, Nicole, you might want to pick a different book subject. Hackers in the trade would run away from me. They would literally prepare for me, not literally, but prepare for my presence with bug spray. They would just see me and run. And so it was really, really hard. And that's pretty much the number one reason why it took me 7 years to get this book out. But there were exceptions all along the way. And in journalism, you hope you find one of these exceptions. I found one of the US government's first 0-day brokers, and it took time to earn his trust. But eventually he agreed that he would basically walk me through the beginnings of this industry, so long as I changed his name. He was out of the industry by now. He's now working in cyber defense somewhere. But he started this industry. He started purchasing 0-days from hackers all over the world. He had amazing stories about showing up at these hacking conferences with giant duffel bags of cash to purchase these 0-days, bring the code back, hone it a little bit, and then sell it to US government agencies and intelligence agencies and such. Back then, he was just working with US agencies. But now that everyone his eyes, all around the world have woken up to the potential for code, for counterintelligence and counterterrorism, and to spy on critics of autocratic regimes, and to potentially use this code to exact destruction on critical systems. There is no government on earth, with the exception of maybe Antarctica and a handful of others, that are not now trying to stockpile their own 0-day exploits and offensive hacking tools. So the reason he ultimately agreed to speak with me beyond the immediate logistics and conditions we agreed to was he had concerns about the fact that, sure, maybe he was in this business when the US had first mover advantage, but now everyone else was in this business too. And it was only a matter of time before this trade catalyzed some major cyber-induced kinetic attack on America's infrastructure. And so he was actually encouraging me, keep going on this. I'll tell you what I know, but I've been out of the business for so long. Keep going. There were others, like there was someone, I wanted to structure the book that I was really telling the story of this trade, of this market through people, because I didn't want it to be technically intimidating. And so I tried to find one person who could really symbolize that tranche of the market. So this guy I called Jimmy Sabian became, he spoke for the brokers in this space and sort of for the early history of this market. But where I was really having a lot of anxiety was, who am I going to get to speak for the US intelligence community? Because all of this has been classified. And finally, someone said, why don't you just talk to the US godfather of cyber war? I had no idea we had a US godfather of cyber war. But it turns out there's this guy, Jim Gosler, that everyone at the highest level of these intelligence agencies sort of agrees was the US godfather of cyber war. he was there. He never told me anything classified, but he was there when the US Embassy in Moscow discovered a major implant in their typewriters. The Soviets had introduced this crazy sophisticated implant for our IBM Selectric typewriters that had a magnetometer that measured every little disturbance, magnetic disturbance from each keywritten stroke, cataloged it and sent it to a listening unit in the embassy in the embassy chimney. And that's how the Soviets were getting our unencrypted communications. And so he was the one who really pushed to declassify that discovery. And he spent a lot of time talking to me about it, because he said really what that was the biggest wake-up call for the US government, that unless we started assuming compromise, and unless we started hacking every new piece of technology that came on the market and finding ways into it and finding how to use it for our own intelligence, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and specifically imminently in the Cold War, we would lose the Cold War, and we would probably lose every war after that. And so that's what spearheaded it. And then he spent a lot of time at NSA, spent a lot of time at the CIA, standing up these divisions at the agency, which really focused on digital implantation and exploitation. But he, is now in retirement. And the reason he had an interest in speaking to me, I think, was that he doesn't think anyone is awake to the level of the threat and just how serious it could be. And so that was his own motivation for talking to me. So what I found was that some people really just we were actually aligned on some of these issues. And those were the people who were willing to speak to me. And it was interesting, even the hackers, really who were forbidden from secrecy, it's almost like human nature to want to brag about your best work. And it's like the one thing I had on the 0-day market is that people were sick of being silenced, and that they couldn't just talk about this awesome thing that they had developed that the NSA was now using. And so that became a reason why they would talk to me off the record. It just over and over again, you find that actually it really is human nature to want to discuss these things. And the fact that the 0-day market is such a fight club, and just had this huge silencing element to it was actually, people were frustrated. And I was tapping into that frustration by just asking them very basic questions about where this was all headed and the consequences for some of these sales. And at the end, they helped flesh out the book, but I've only scratched the surface. I have only scratched the surface on this thing. And so part of the motivation for the book is, look, I just cracked the nut open. I have my own ideas about what comes next, but I want everyone else to now know that this is happening, and also start asking their own questions about where this is all headed.
So we've only just really started to see, I guess, the top of the iceberg peeking above the waves now that your book is out there. I think one thing that I found fascinating reading about that incident with the IBM typewriters is that this took place all the way back, I believe, in the early 1980s. So we're looking 40 years ago. We've known about this cyber threat for that long. How is it that we haven't been able to get our arms around it in all this time?
I think the main thing is we have been trading on cybersecurity in the name of convenience and speed, move fast and break things. That is the Silicon Valley MO still to this day. And speed is the natural enemy of security. Security teams are consistently considered the whiners, the party poopers at these organizations. No one wants to be bothered with updating their software. It's annoying. Security is annoying. It creates lag times. All we wanted to do was just hook up all these systems for convenience and connectivity, and we never thought, how could this possibly be used against us? And now it's being used against us every single day. And I was just telling the last class that for me, ransomware is a good thing. because it's a blessing in disguise. It's showing American corporations and the American people how vulnerable we are to cybercrime. Think about if it's not a cyber criminal gang, think about if it's Russia, think about if it's China, and we see this sort of situation in the South China Sea or Taiwan escalate. I really think that the next major geopolitical conflict will either be a cyber war or will have some major cyber component to it. And the country that survives that conflict, that wins that conflict, I think will look a lot like a digital Israel, a country that can basically continue to run its most basic functions and services, even while it's surrounded by hostile neighbors and hostile activity. And we are not that nation. And so ransomware is just giving us a glimpse. But we are very close to getting to that sort of nation state directed incident. And so I think, my answer to your question would have been, well, security is boring, it's annoying, it's costly, and all those things are still true. But I think finally people are understanding what the cost of inaction is for cybersecurity. That, and the other thing is, for too long, businesses could hide these attacks. And they were incentivized to. If a group came and stole your critical intellectual property, you don't want to publicize that. It's the last thing you want to publicize. But ransomware, you can't hide it. They lock up your systems, no one can access the network. And on top of that, over the last year, these criminal gangs have started also leaking your data. So they charge you a price to not only relinquish your data to decrypt it, but also to delete your data. And if you don't, they start dribbling your data out online. That's why we knew the NRA got hit with ransomware over the last couple of weeks, because apparently they didn't pay because their data is still showing up on this ransomware gang site. So, for the first time, I think people are understanding that they better do something about this. And I think boards are finally asking, what are we doing about this?
So I kind of want to pivot off the ransomware topic to something that you actually talked about a bit in the class immediately preceding this talk, which is this notion of preparing the battlefield. And I think what you referred to in your book is a cyberkinetic attack. What does that look like if we get to that scenario where Russia or China decides it's time to pull the trigger?
Yeah, so it looks like Colonial Pipeline, only the pipeline would have stayed down. There would have been no ransom to pay to get access back to your systems. Flights would not have jet fuel. People wouldn't be able to get gas. There would be panic buying. But I mentioned this in the last class, when Colonial Pipeline was hit, one of the things my colleague and I obtained was a classified DOE assessment that we published in the New York Times, which said as a country, we can only afford 2 to 3 more days of the pipeline being down. Not so much for the gas and jet fuel, we sort of have redundancies around that, but the diesel was really becoming an issue because all of these refineries relied on diesel. And so as a country, we could have only afforded 2 or 3 more days of one pipeline operator down because a ransomware group came and hit their IT network. They didn't even hit the pipeline. They hit the IT network, and Colonial Pipeline shut down the pipeline because they couldn't bill their customers downstream. Their billing system shut off. So think about what that attack would look like if it was nation state directed and they kept it offline. And what if they coordinated it with some other attack on the grid, or they kept the power out, or hospitals, or hacked a water treatment facility? All of those things I just mentioned have already happened. Fortunately, it's just been a cyber criminal gang, or when it was a nation state, it was nation state hackers just poking around to see how far they could get, not to actually push the button. And so all of the access has already been achieved. The tools are there. The attack that really freaks me out and keeps me up at night was an attack a couple of years ago, 2019, I believe. Someone hacked into a Saudi petrochemical plant, and they used a couple 0 days in Schneider Electric safety locks. They dismantled the safety locks. That's the last thing you would do if you were a hacker, if you were trying to trigger some kind of deadly explosion. You would take out the safety locks. They were looking for the safety locks, and that's what their 0 days were for. Fortunately, it shut the whole plant down. It triggered a whole bug that sent the plant shutting down. So everyone did the forensics. The immediate suspect was Iran, because Iranian hackers had hacked Saudi Aramco, which was a really high profile attack, and a number of other Saudi petrochemical and oil facilities. It took a year to figure out that no, it was actually this graduate research university outside Moscow that had done this attack. Why are they hacking the safety locks at a Saudi petrochemical plant? I think they were playing around not just with their tools, but with attribution. How can we pull off something like this and make it clear, that Russia's not the first immediate suspect? So we've seen them playing around with these capabilities in Ukraine and then the Saudi petrochemical plant. We've also seen them play around with attribution. At one point, this Russian group we know as Sandworm, which is a division of the GRU, hacked French television networks and took them all offline and claimed to be ISIS. They hacked the opening ceremony at the Olympics in Seoul. And obviously the immediate suspect there was North Korea, but it turned out to be Russia. We've seen them hack into Iran's command and control infrastructure and launch attacks from there. So I think they're playing around with attribution. So I mentioned that to say, the other thing is, all of these attacks could happen in tandem that I mentioned on water treatment facilities, on a pipeline, and we might not know immediately who pulled it off. How do you respond to something like that when it's not even clear immediately who's behind it? And I think the pressure to respond would be so great that the opportunity for miscalculation and escalation in this realm is actually much higher, and the frequency could be much higher than most people anticipate or could even imagine. And so that is really the worst case scenario for me. And right now, I think the only thing holding us back is that we haven't seen the geopolitical trigger just yet. But as we all know, there are flashpoints all over the world right now. And every time I see the escalation of fighter jets in Taiwan airspace or whatever it is, I'm always looking at it through a cyber lens of, is this going to be the trigger?
So altogether, this ends up painting, I think, a really scary picture, because on the one hand, you've got this 0-day market where, correct me if I'm wrong, these exploits are trading for 6 figures or maybe a couple $1 million, with the potential to cause potentially cataclysmic damage to nation states. And I think the analogy that came to my mind as I was reading this is that it's like being able to go down to Walmart, buy an atomic bomb, set it off, and nobody knows you did it while you go home at the end of the day. Is this ever something that governments might be able to get their arms around? Or who should we be looking to really as the leaders to handle this issue?
So I think we've almost hit rock bottom. You see it with ransomware every day. We just haven't had that cataclysmic nation state directed attack play out just yet that's cost us lives, but we are inching closer to it. And I think we're waiting for this geopolitical trigger. So what should governments do about this? It's really hard. It's really hard. Nuclear analogies always fall apart when you apply them to cyber, because attribution is hard, because the barrier to entry is so much lower. You don't need fissile material to send off a nuclear weapon. You just need a computer, cyber weapon. You just need a computer. Offensive tools can easily be turned back and used on you. We've seen that a couple of years ago. The NSA's own stockpile of 0-day exploits was hacked. We don't even know by who. Someone called the shadow brokers started dribbling them out online. North Korea used them in a ransomware attack that was a little sloppy, so it was neutralized pretty quickly. But then Russia used the NSA's 0 days in an attack on Ukraine that got out and zoomeranged around the world and hit Merck and FedEx. All of these, the Cadbury egg chocolate factory in Tasmania, took out the radiation monitors at the old Chernobyl nuclear site. I mention all of that because it's the world is so connected now that the collateral damage for any of these one attacks is so great. So there is some pressure for some kind of digital Geneva Convention. And the person who's really been leading that charge is Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, who's sick and tired of Microsoft Windows showing up in these nation state attacks all the time, and Microsoft customers really feeling the blowback for these attacks. So I think he makes a great point. He says, shouldn't we agree not to hack one another's elections or hospitals or civilian systems like the power grid and railways and aviation systems? I think that sounds wonderful, and I'm so glad someone is out there beating the drum on these things. The problem is that logistically, it's complicated, and also we don't have a lot of faith in our adversaries to hold true to those agreements. So in the United States, any attack that comes from the United States comes out of the Pentagon. It comes from Cyber Command or maybe NSA or another intelligence agency. So what US intelligence officials say is, listen, we'd love to agree to something like that, but we'd only be handcuffing ourselves, because look at what Russia does. They outsource many of these attacks to cyber criminals. And I mentioned this in the last class, but Putin said a couple of years ago, hackers are like artists. They just wake up in the morning in a good mood and start painting. I have nothing to do with what they do or don't do. And so long as he has that level of plausible deniability, we would never make an agreement with him when he could just as easily sort of outsource these attacks to cyber criminals. The same is true for a lot of our adversaries. China has increasingly relied on this sort of loose network of contractors that are typically private citizens that are really good at their security jobs during the day, and then are tapped to moonlight for government operations at night. That's not just me speaking, that was sort of one of the documents that was in the Snowden trove that I was given access to. And the NSA really didn't even have a clear understanding of what that relationship looked like. They just said, based on the targeting, we believe that these people have a probable intelligence feed requirement. Iran has used front companies. We've seen that show up in indictments. So over and over again, we're at a disadvantage here because we don't rely on outside hackers to pull off these nation state operations for us, the United States, whereas our adversaries do. And we don't have that level of plausible deniability. And that's really when something like a digital Geneva Convention falls apart. And in the absence of a convention, what has happened on the ground is we have really stumbled into this era of mutually assured digital destruction. We have caught Russian hackers targeting our nuclear plants. We have caught them inside the grid. We've caught them breaching oil companies. We've caught Chinese hackers inside the pipelines. A couple of weeks ago, we declassified this report that said, yes, these Chinese nation state hackers have been breaching American pipelines over the last decade, and we believe that this is battlefield preparation. And the US has been doing this too. So I broke a story a couple of years ago with my colleague David Sanger about how we were hacking into the Russian grid, and we were making a pretty big show of it. We wanted Russia to know that we were hacking into their grid in order to, maybe they would think twice, before doing to us what they've already done in Ukraine, which is turn the lights off twice in 2 separate attacks. So that's where we are, but no one really even knows that this is happening. No one really understands that this critical infrastructure is being leveraged and weaponized in the name of sort of mutually assured digital destruction. And so what we're left with is, okay, if this is what the world is, this is where the world is headed, how do we become the digital Israel? And that's why you see American officials right now really trying to figure this out. We have not figured out deterrence. The indictments and the sanctions and the naming and shaming have only worked a little bit, but it's not stopping the onslaught of ransomware and probes that we continue to see. So there is a working group at the State Department with the US and some of our close allies trying to come up with a menu of consequences that says, okay, where is the bar for retaliation, and what does retaliation look like? Is it just more sanctions, naming and shaming indictments, or will we do a counterattack? And if we do a counterattack, what would it look like? And where is the red line for those kinds of attacks? So the good news is that we are engaging in these conversations at the highest levels right now. it was very good news for me that top of the agenda for Biden's first summit meeting with Putin in Geneva was ransomware and cyber attacks. It's a baby step, but good that we're actually engaged in these conversations. But I think, ultimately we're going to need some kind of norms of behavior outlined, but first and foremost, we just need to raise the bar for our cyber defense, because as I regularly point out to people, that Colonial Pipeline attack, how did it happen? It happened because Colonial Pipeline forgot to deactivate an old employee account and didn't have two-factor authentication switched on. And as long as it's that easy for someone to take out the major conduit for gas and jet fuel and diesel for the entire East Coast of the United States, forget about it. Forget about international norms of behavior. We really have to start there.
Thank you, Nicole. And I've got plenty more questions of my own. We could probably do this all afternoon, but I would love to open up the floor for audience questions so that everybody's got a chance to ask what they want to ask.
Hey, thanks, Nicole, for being here. General Nakasone, the NSA and Cyber Command Director, recently testified to the Senate and said in both the SolarWinds and the Microsoft attack, not only can they not connect the dots, they can't see the dots because the Title 10 and Title 50 authorities says the Department of Defense and national security agencies of the US cannot operate domestically. What they want to talk about is what's the threshold of war. And let's say you were sitting in that Senate panel and you had to make the determination of what the threshold of war is where Cyber Command and the NSA could operate domestically. What is that?
It's a really good question. And I think, SolarWinds, I haven't mentioned it until now, but just so everyone knows, so SolarWinds is this attack that we're still unwinding right now, where Russia's elite hacking group, which is inside the SVR, hacked into an American company, SolarWinds, whose customers included more than 400 of the Fortune 500 and most US federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, like the Department of Energy, the nuclear labs, and also a lot of American utility companies. And they used SolarWinds software update as a Trojan horse to break into these systems. So we're always being told, keep your software up to date. Well, in this case, you didn't want this software update. When you got it, you basically invited the SVR into your system. So General Nakasone is absolutely right. They found our blind spot because the NSA can't look at domestic traffic. And where did they launch that attack from? Not just from an American company. They launched it from servers in New Jersey, GoDaddy servers, I think I remember. So they've really used these civil liberty protections against us. And after Snowden, all of the conversations were how do we make sure the NSA never gets in to our data centers at Google and Yahoo ever again? We already have to comply with these legal orders. We don't want them coming in the back door too. After that, those disclosures, when I would go interview people at Google, they would say, over my dead body, am I ever giving the NSA any access or any information that I'm not legally complied to do? I think the conversation has become more nuanced now. I think we understand that we're under a level of threat where we need to talk about things like what would the threshold be? But before we start inviting the NSA into our domestic networks, I think we really need to work on real public, private threat sharing, real-time collaboration. That is the only way you can do it in a free market society. In Israel, they do make compromises. They say, listen, we're under constant threat. We're willing to let the government inside our networks to block these attacks in real time. So far, there appears to be no willingness on the part of America's technology companies to do this, particularly when their biggest customer base is not in the United States anymore. Increasingly, it's overseas for companies like Apple, et cetera. So what do we do with these constraints? I think we need real-time information sharing. I think we need to do it in a way where you protect civil liberties, but you're constantly sharing things like malware strains, IP addresses, real-time threat intelligence about what these individual actors that we continue to see over and over again, where their latest targeting is. You know, if they're after nuclear propulsion technology, why are we not sharing the indicators of compromise and malware strains and IP addresses with companies that make nuclear propulsion technology in real time? And that hasn't been happening. You know, we're getting to a place where increasingly you see DHS, which has become sort of the conduit or the front door for this public-private collaboration, saying everyone needs to patch this Pulse VPN 0-day right now because we know China's using it. That's actually a big step forward. That wasn't happening over the last decade. That's new. And I think we're going to continue to see that, but we're probably in for a lot of short-term pain before we truly figure that out. And then I think at some point, we're going to have conversations around critical infrastructure. You know, 85% of our critical infrastructure in the United States is run by the private sector. Some of it is a PG&E that can build up their own mini intelligence agency and engage the government in sort of these closer collaborations. But a lot of it are these little local water treatment facilities that have no IT person on staff. And I think that might be an area for compromise, potentially on something that some might see as a civil liberties infringement. But I don't think it's going to be out of the question at a certain point that we would want someone at that water treatment facility making sure that no one's coming for the chemical controls at that water treatment facility. I would prefer to see a world where we get people on site and they have some sort of grant or funding, like what was just in the infrastructure bill, to try and get the right people in position to search for that level of activity and that kind of behavior and block it before it ever impacts anyone downstream, but we're not there yet.
Just want to push back real quick. The first story that you had was New York Times getting hacked and you were pissed that there was no cavalry. The cavalry is headed by General Nakasone and you still don't want him. And so I just want to clarify that you're where you started and where you are now is the same position.
No, I appreciate that. What I want was the FBI to give us what they had on attribution. Who did it? I want to see those people in jail. You know, they weren't sharing any information about attribution. They weren't sharing anything. Anything we got from Mandiant. That's what I'm saying. I want that information. I want to know what they know. And based on what I saw in the Snowden documents, they knew a lot. They knew a lot about who hacked RSA. They knew a lot about who hacked Google. They knew a lot about how that information was leveraged to attack Lockheed Martin. That was never shared with the private sector in any kind of actionable way. So it's not sort of a black or white. It's give that information to the targets. You know, let them know who did it so that they understand what the threat level is. But do I want Paul Nakasone, you know, sitting inside Times headquarters? Like maybe, but probably not. I think my colleagues and I who work on a lot of stories about the NSA probably don't want him inside our emails.
Got a question over the back.
Thanks so much for being here. My name is Lisa Einstein. I'm actually working with someone you know, Alex Samos, on a book right now. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about looking back on your book writing process, things you would have changed, things you thought worked really well, and then also how you deal, once your book is out there, with criticism and sort of things like maybe, it's scary to put your voice out there. I admire you for doing it and I'm experiencing some fear right now about it. And I'm curious if you could give advice about like processes and practices that you have for this.
Okay, I love this question and I feel like I'm the worst person to answer it because it took me 7 years to find a process. And I don't think anyone wants to replicate my process. My process was freak out, do nothing, be paralyzed, and think about everyone who's going to scream at you on Twitter for 3 years, and then maybe you start writing. And the way I finally did it was, so I have a little kid, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it after hours. I spend all day covering cybersecurity threats. The last thing I could do was go home at night after bedtime and stay up writing about more cybersecurity stuff. So I actually had to go to a cabin in the woods, and I would wake up, I would have water, I would write 1,000 words. And then when I hit the 1,000 word, I would go bike into town and get breakfast. And I would come back and I would edit what I wrote over with wine. And that seemed to work the best. The other thing was, it's really scary, especially in cybersecurity, because the cybersecurity technical community loves to eat people alive. You know, they will shred you. And they really don't love the New York Times, to put it mildly. And they really don't like it when I translate some of these very technical issues for a lay audience, because they're always going to rip something I said apart. And sometimes it's good, and sometimes I have to issue a correction, or it improves, you know, my work. But more often than not, it becomes a writer's block. You know, it's just really scary to write about these issues for the lay audience. And I would encourage you to try and put that out of your head, because for something like Alex's book, everyone in the cybersecurity has heard what Alex has to say about these issues. They know it. They already know it. The people who don't know it need to be able to understand the language. It needs to be translated for the lay audience. And sometimes that means you're going to have to scare people. And some people are going to say you're scaring people too much. You know, FUD, that's the code word. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Everyone gets accused of spreading FUD. But these issues are very real. And no one knows it more than Alex, because he was on the front lines at Yahoo, you know, at Facebook, when Russia was using some of these systems for attempted disinformation and maybe election interference. So just put them out of your head. You know, you're not writing for those people. They're going to read it and they're going to yell at you on Twitter. And you're a woman, so you're going to get it harder. But just keep going, because just keep your real audience in mind, and then just 1,000 words editing.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Got a question over here.
Thank you for joining us. I want to echo some of the praise for the book. Incredibly engaging. My question is about bug bounties. And so I know we've seen over the years companies put up some money for this, but often not enough, especially compared to state-sponsored organizations. Why not? Microsoft and Apple have the funds if they wanted to, I would imagine. So why are they not taking the lead on paying the hackers that are finding these 0 days?
Great question. And I think I used to share that thought, like, why don't they try and match government bounty rewards? And the answer is that they don't think they'll ever be able to match government payouts. You know, $2.5 million for an iOS 0-day exploit times, you know, an infinity level of possible vulnerabilities in their systems and software. So, you know, they'll always be outbid, but also they don't want to create perverse incentives for their own security engineers. Like, if you are a security engineer at Apple and you're making $500,000, which is what I assume their head of security makes plus stock or something, and it's $2.5 million in rewards to just turn over a single 0-day exploit, why are you working at Apple? You know, and ultimately, I guess you could argue that you're working for the same cause, which is securing Apple software and systems. So I think that's the main one, is they don't want to create a perverse incentive. But I think realistically, you know, where we've seen the 0-day exploit market going is to these big pocketed governments in the UAE and Saudi Arabia that have tons of oil money to spend on this. They don't have the skills or the people necessarily, although they're getting there. And what they've realized is, okay, we don't really need the skills or the people. We can just buy this off this market. We can pay, in some cases, ex-NSA analysts, which I describe in the book, to be our mercenaries. And so they'll pay, you know, they'll just double whatever it is that Google or Apple would announce for their bounty. The other thing is, Google will pay you for the 0-day itself, you know, the actual vulnerability. And I'll just stop there for a second, because it's important to understand. If I'm a hacker and I find a vulnerability in Apple's iOS system and Apple doesn't know about it, that's the 0-day. But I still have to write the code to exploit it. That's the 0-day exploit. And that 0-day exploit could be, if it's a good one, could be used to remotely access your phone calls, your text messages, your location, on and on and on. Doesn't matter if you're using Signal or an encrypted messaging app. If they're in your phone, they're in your phone, like you. So what the bug bounty programs are for is they'll pay, you know, $250,000 for the 0-day. and you can get that money, and you don't actually have to spend many, many months writing the exploit. So on some level, it's a little bit apples to oranges to think about just matching the 0-day exploit price. And that's a good thing, because a lot of hackers have told me in the course of researching this book that it's getting harder to write a really good 0-day exploit. The more resources companies like Apple and Microsoft and Google pour into their security, the harder it is for them to develop a really good remote 0-day exploit. And so that means it takes many, many months or more manpower. So if they can neutralize that really quickly by just paying out for the 0-day, then they don't have to worry about the 0-day exploit pricing as much.
Thanks, Nicole. Hearing your talk, I was remembering at the time 10 years ago, I was sitting with David Sanger in Kennedy School class. But back then, he covered, like, cybersecurity was one of the 10 sections that he covered. But I think now with the sort of imminent and also increasing importance of this the cyberspace, how would that change the way that we look at the power of those sovereign nations? Like you mentioned that barrier to entry became definitely lower, but at the same time, many of the names that you mentioned are China, Russia, USA, are pretty strong factors. And traditionally, we have defined the power in terms of the military expenditure. But how this rise of cybersecurity would change that? Like, do they give rise to sort of like small to mid-sized power in terms of solo nation or non-state actors? And how would you quantify the power?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting and it's changing so quickly. But yeah, so we used to, and the reason I focus on those countries is really because one of the documents I saw in the Snowden Trove when I was part of that project was the first, I mentioned this in the previous class, the first national intelligence estimate that mentioned cyber threats from our adversaries. And this was 2010. And what it said was that we believe Russia was the most sophisticated, but really where we were seeing those skills used was in cybercrime. This was sort of people who had this wonderful technical education, but they didn't have the same job prospects, so they had moved to cybercrime. So actually, in terms of nation state adversaries, we were more worried about China because they were so prolific and brazen in stealing US intellectual property. And then below those actors were Israel was just mentioned in there to say, this is an ally, but they are potentially as good as we are because we partnered on some of these operations with them. But then below that was people who wanted to do governments that wanted to do the US harm, but didn't necessarily have the skills or capabilities to do so. And the top two there were North Korea and Iran. And so we deemed that they wanted to do the US harm and wanted to acquire these cyber capabilities, but they didn't yet have them. And sort of the story ever since is that we grossly underestimated how quickly they would acquire these capabilities. They might not have the same capabilities as the US or Israel or Russia or China, but they don't need a Stuxnet. They don't need some advanced cyber weapon that takes out a nuclear plant. They just need rudimentary wiping code that can wipe your systems clean, and any American bank would be completely screwed. So they've become sort of our chief worry. But then below that, there's all these governments that do have the skills, do have the people, but their interest isn't really in using these tools to do, the US harm. Like we've seen a lot of companies that offer surveillance tools and 0-day exploits pop up in India because India wants to use them sometimes on their own people, we've unfortunately learned, but also against Pakistan. North Korea right now are really focused not so much on pulling off the next Sony attack because they were upset with something Sony is going to put out. They've actually been leveraging these tools to hack cryptocurrency exchanges and banks so that they can get the money to skirt sanctions to get back to their nuclear weapons programs. In the Middle East, we see the Gulf states trying to pay former NSA guys to come work out of Abu Dhabi or go work directly in Saudi Arabia to give them the tools so that they can hack Qatar or they can hack their own people, critics of the regime. So it's not really, it's a different power game. Everyone has a reason for using these tools. And it's not necessarily to exact destruction on another nation, although that would be the case with India and Pakistan, for example. But really what we've seen the Gulf use these for is surveillance of their Gulf enemy, their local Gulf enemy, but primarily they're using it against journalists and dissidents and human rights activists and that kind of thing.
You don't have to create perverse incentives for those engineers to leave because they're already doing it. And they know they write the security code and then they go somewhere else and get paid a lot of money to write more code that beats it. There are two things I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on. One was encryption, right? Every now and then the shooting in California was a good example. People all of a sudden want Apple and Google to build backdoors into phones, and so far the U.S. government's resisted that, and I think for good reason, right? Because encryption actually helps everybody and prevents backdoors, and they can usually beat it anyway. But I think I really wish the NSA and CISA would work together on kind of building the same thing in regard to exploits. It's something you hinted at. Just make everybody secure and make it so only the most exquisite elements can actually exploit anything. I also kind of wonder, in like a rock, paper, scissors approach, if hacking the hackers is the best approach. I wonder if maybe the US had a more sophisticated policy on how we interpret cyber actions within like the law of armed conflict. If that might be a more effective deterrent. I don't know if you kind of talked to anyone about that writing your book.
Yeah, I mean, it's, we talked about this a little bit in the last class. The hacking the hackers is interesting. I think we have started to use been willing to conduct more offensive operations. Like the big one was Stuxnet, but I really classify that as a counter-nuclear proliferation effort. Under Trump, after the election, Paul Nakasone was hacking into the Internet Research Agency, the Russian troll network's computers, and dropping a little note for them before the 2018 midterms, say, we know who you are and we're coming for you if you do anything in this election. I actually, as a journalist, you're supposed to just be very neutral about these things. But there's definitely a part of me after covering these attacks on US infrastructure and the elections that was like, yes. But then the Russian grid is a complicated one. Do we believe that's really the future of deterrence, hacking into the Russian grid so that if they turn off our lights here, we'll turn around and do the same thing there, just that the threat would hang over them? I told the story in the last class, but when we learned that Cyber Command had obtained more rain, looser rain to go conduct attacks, one of the first things they did was they went and hacked the Russian grid and made a loud show of it. And when I learned that with David Sanger, we went to the National Security Council and we said, what say you? We're going to publish this. And we assumed that they would say, you'll have blood on your hands, or all of the things you hear when you're a journalist in the space. Instead, they said, we have no problem with you publishing this story. We want it to be known that we've been hacking the Russian grid. We want Russia to think twice. Now, you'd have to be a fly on the wall in Vladimir Putin's office, which I would love to be, just for a day or two, to find out whether that has deterred them from turning the SolarWinds attack from espionage into destruction, or whether that deterred Putin or the Kremlin from going further on the 2020 election. I don't know. But there's very interesting questions to be asked along those lines about legitimizing civilian infrastructure as a deterrent. Hacking the hackers in the private sector is also a really interesting conversation. And where we saw the most temptation to do this was around 2012, 2013. One of the ways that we believe Iran retaliated for the Stuxnet attack was with denial of service attacks on American banks and Wall Street. And they were launching these really powerful denial of service attacks from these bot networks, essentially, on these banks. These banking websites were collapsing under the load. And there were several meetings, as I understand, between people like Jamie Dimon and executives at these banks with the Obama administration, where they said, why can't we hit back harder at them? We want to, there were some people who wanted to take out their command and control servers or flood their networks with a DDoS attack. And you can understand the temptation in that case. The problem is the room for escalation. So long as the rest of America's critical infrastructure is still vulnerable and they don't have the money that JP Morgan has, to build up these offensive teams and these security teams, we're still vulnerable and the potential for escalation is huge. So we determined that no, we should not be promoting hackbacks. But, unfortunately, it's a very interesting space because it really is American businesses that find themselves on the front line. That's why this is an asymmetrical threat. And there's a lot more to be gleaned by our adversaries in hacking America's critical infrastructure instead of hacking Cyber Command. They can steal our intellectual property, they can turn off the pipeline, they can hack into a water treatment facility. And that's why we are actually at a disadvantage as a free market society. Because we won't let Cyber Command and NSA inside these networks to block these attacks in real time. So we have to deal with a free market economy and the structural impediments, which means how do we better incentivize private companies to up their cybersecurity posture? And I think that's really where this administration is doing a very good job, bringing the right people in and trying to figure their way around the politics of this. So very quickly, the Biden administration came up with what I think is the most comprehensive cybersecurity executive order on record. And what they said was, they're limited in who they control. So they can control the federal agencies. So they said, okay, from now on, you must meet these cybersecurity standards. And they're working on that. And that's long overdue, but credit where credit is due. And then contractors, okay, they don't actually have direct oversight of how these contractors handle their cybersecurity, but they've done something clever, which is to use the power of the purse. So what they said is, listen, we'll do away with all the red tape. Here are the standards. NIST will put them out. You meet these standards. You can self-certify that you meet these standards. We won't even make you go through some government audit. But if we catch you lying to us, if you don't have two-factor authentication enabled, if you're using Windows XP software that hasn't been updated for a decade, you're banned from ever doing business with the federal government again. And for these contractors, that's game over. So that's clever. That's the first real stick we've seen in this space. In my book, I talk a lot about incentives. And I think I would like to see a world where we offer serious tax credits to companies that operate critical infrastructure if they subject themselves to a real penetration test, where hackers come in and they hack their systems and they show them where their vulnerabilities are. And they do this over time so that you have artifacts showing whether a company is actually trying to improve their cyber defenses. And if they meet a certain level or rating, then they should get tax credits for that. Something like that. I think it's high time that we move the conversation away from should companies disclose a cybersecurity breach, which I think they should, to, okay, but now how do we really incentivize companies to withstand these attacks, and how do we use free market tools to do that? And I think tax credits is one.
Nicole, thank you so much for sticking with us past the hour. We really appreciate having you here. Let's give Nicole one last round.